Today we're talking about Chapter 29, React Part 1. So our first look at React will discuss how it's a library used for web apps based around JavaScript and HTML. So we'll talk about the difference between libraries and frameworks, and then the concept of what a component is, because React is one of several things out there that involves component-based architecture for your application. Then we'll look at how to spin up a React application using Vite and how to create individual components and then actually use them, place them in your application so that they appear on the page where you want them to be. I'm going to introduce the concept of props and show you how to use props to make your components reusable with different pieces of data for each one. And then a real quick thing about using CSS with React. There's a couple of different ways to do it. So let's get started. So there are a number of different tools out there for creating JavaScript applications that aren't just, vanilla JS in the DOM. Libraries like React, Vue, Svelte, they have special syntax, they've got some built-in tools, and make it easy to have some pretty neat ways of rendering web pages that are highly interactive and run right there in the browser and don't depend on having calls to a backend just to be able to do things like animations and quick updates of information on the page. Frameworks would be things like Next.js, SvelteKit, Angular. They provide even more functionality than libraries do, and for a really, complete, robust application. And Vite is a build tool that's used to create a React application. And when you use Vite together with React, it functions a little bit like a framework because it gives you more structure. So we'll take more of a look at Vite in a minute. But I want to talk about components. Since React is all about component-based architecture, a component is just a building block. It's a block of code that returns HTML, and it can be put anywhere in your application that you need it to be. So you can build an entire application for the web with components that are defined in JavaScript modules. And sometimes you have a component that's just for a single use. It's for a specific page on your site and nothing else is going to look quite right like that. On the other hand, you can have very, very small components that represent something that you need over and over and over again. Even in this diagram, you can see we've got a full page, which itself would probably be a component. And then you've got this hero image here at the top, and maybe this is a slider where, images go back and forth. That whole thing could be a component. And then you might have components like this, where you have little cards on a page with images and text. And each of those are the same component, just used over and over again with slightly different information each time. And you can break it down from there. You could have a component that's just a way to style a link on your page or, a certain bit of text or something. So you can think big and you can think small. All of them are going to be the building blocks of the page. Those are components. Sometimes they're very complex and sometimes they're very, very simple. So we're going to look at, how to use some things and put together a small app. Starting today, we're going to build it over time for the next couple of classes as we continue to learn more about React. And so you'll start to see how this works as we start having these different components all working together. Okay. So let's talk about how you would use Vite to create a React application. You need to do the following. First, install Vite with npm create and then Vite at latest. So what this does is use the Node package manager to go get the latest version of Vite for your machine, and then it will create that. So then you go ahead and give the application a name. You choose React as the specific library you want to use, and then you choose JavaScript as the language you want to use in conjunction with React, because you're going to have multiple choices. And then it's going to create the application based on the name you gave it, and you will have a new directory that has that name. So you navigate into that, and then that's when you run npm install to make sure all the dependencies for the application have been installed. Then when you're ready to spin it up, you do npm run dev, and it will serve the application at your home address at port 5173. That should be the default. One more thing to consider, if you cloned someone else's application, or maybe you had your app created it a while back, and now you're coming back and you're having trouble getting it to serve, just run npm install again, and it will update your dependencies, and then you should be good. So let's go do this. I've got a directory here for chapter 29 for my lecture examples, and I would like to create an application for the very first time. So I'm going to start with npm create vite at latest. Okay, it asks me if it's okay to proceed. I'm going to say Y for yes and hit enter. Okay, now it asks me for a project name. I'm going to call this Garden Planning Tool. And now I can actually use my arrow keys to come down here and choose React from this list of different possible ways to build this. So I want React, and then I want regular JavaScript, the third one down. And boom. So now it tells you, here's what you need to do next. CD into Garden Planning Tool, npm install, and then npm run dev. So those last three steps are right there for you in case you forget. So I can go into the directory, and if I list it, you can see I could already got files here, and it's the same files you see right here that have just been created. And now I can install my dependencies. We should see our node modules folder pop up and a package lock.json file once it's finished. It might take a second because there's quite a few things that it's got to install here. There you go. So now I have both of those, and I should be good to go. So now npm run dev is the command to get it up and running. Okay, so it says that it's running, and it tells you that it's at 127.0.0.1 port 5173. So I can command click on this on my Mac, and it will bring it up in the browser. And you can see that we've got a sample app here where it just says, hey, you've created this app with Vite and React. You can click on this button and it updates the count on the button, and just gives you a little bit of an idea of what a small application looks like. They already have some code in place for you. Now we're going to need to go and clean that out a little bit so we can put our own application in place, but you can at least confirm that it's working, right? Let's talk about the file structure, and we'll take a look around at some of the files now that we've created our application. You really need to know what does what, so I will walk you through that. The index.html file, which is out here in the main directory, is what the browser uses at the top level. So everything ultimately is going to pour all of the components and everything, they're all going to point back to that index.html file so that it'll hold the entire application. And there's a div in there that has an ID of root. That's where all the content gets rendered that comes from all of the components. And the script will point to whatever the primary source is for the content, and that's going to be either main.jsx or index.jsx. So if we look over here, we can take a look at these first ones. Here's that index.html file. We've got a title, Vite plus React, and then we just have div with an ID of root. And there's nothing in here, but that's because it gets provided by other files. And then we also see the script that points to main.jsx in the source folder, which is right here. And that has the basics of importing React from the library and making sure it has everything it needs to render the entire application. And it's also, if you notice in that main.jsx file, it imports the global style sheet and then renders that in app.jsx, which is placed right here. So if you have the CSS, and we'll get to this at the end, but if you have CSS that you just want to be available to everything all of the time, you can input it in this file, index.css right here, and every component will be able to find it automatically. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the app.jsx file is where we're going to render our components. Once we've built a couple of components, we're going to actually place them in here to be displayed on the page. So right now you can already see some things that we did actually see on the page, right? The Vite logo, the React logo, this little button here that has a click handler and sets the count to increase it every time it's clicked. And we got a little paragraph here. And if you remember from the last class, we talked about how you can have this combination of JavaScript and HTML. This is called JSX, right? So everything you're looking at here is JSX. Everything from regular HTML elements to these placeholders or the curly braces that allow evaluation of JavaScript. Okay. When you create your own components to start building out your app, you want to put those in a components directory inside the source directory, source/components. And we don't have that right now, right? So let's go ahead and create that. Then we're going to go talk about how we could create some components and we'll come back and use it. So right here in source, I'll add a new directory and call it components. And that's where we're going to want to put our components. All right. So there are actually two different ways to build components, two different types of syntax. And that's because in 2019, they released React 16.8 with some major changes. And up until then, components were built using JavaScript classes. But they have encouraged everyone to really switch as much as possible to using functional components instead of class components. Both of them return JSX to be converted to HTML by Babel. But the older syntax is the class components. I will show you an example of this because you're going to see it out there. And you could even work for a company that still has some legacy code that hasn't been updated where they still have class components. So it's important that you know how to recognize it. It extends the component class and it has this render method that actually returns that JSX. On the other hand, the new syntax, the modern one, is the functional components. And this is where you can pass in data as props to be used, and it returns JSX. It already is a function, so it just returns the JSX. So let's look at the first one, the class component, just so you can see the parts of it and understand how it works. And then we're going to do our header component for this app. We're going to build with a class-based component, very small. It'll only take a minute. And then you'll see an example of that. And then everything we do after that, we'll be using the modern syntax. So old school class-based components. You have to import the React object. You need to name your class in Pascal case, just like you would any other JavaScript class. And then extend the component class. This needs to inherit some things from component. Then define a render method with the JSX that needs to be returned. And you don't need to wrap that in parentheses if the return value is a single line of JSX. But if it has multiple ones, you have to, like if I didn't just have this, return just this button, if I had multiple lines, I would need to wrap that in parentheses. But this is all I've got, so it's simple. Then you need to add export to make sure in front of the class keyword to make sure it can be used outside the module. Okay, so let's come over and do this. I'm going to go ahead and go to my components folder, and I'm going to create a new file and call it header.jsx. Make sure that you have your extensions on these files be .jsx, so it's not regular JavaScript. All right, we need to import from React, and specifically we need to import component. I'm going to use destructuring here to pull the component out from the object that comes back from React. Okay, and then I'm going to create a class header that extends component. And all I need to do is have a render method because this is going to be very simple. So I can just set up my render method like this and just return And in this case, I'm going to actually have multiple lines. So I'm going to use the parentheses like this so that it can hold all 3 lines here of my JSX. And actually, this is JSX, but it's really just HTML, right? There's nothing to be transpiled by Babel into HTML because there's no JavaScript. It's just straight HTML. But that's okay. We just have this little H2, this little heading that says garden planning tool, and that's going to be in our header component. And that's all the header component needs to return is the header element with that heading. So I can finish that off, but I did say that we had to export this, right? We can actually do that right here and say export default class, and it will allow us to do it that way. So I can't really show you this on the page yet because our page still looks like this, right? It just still has the old content. We're going to have to clean all of this out and then place this into the application so that we actually see it. Before I do that, I want to go build one more component, and then I will talk about how we're going to put both of them in at the same time. So that's class-based. It's a class, it extends component, it has a render method that returns the JSX. That's pretty much what you need to know. Okay, so lots of keywords here. Import and from is that modern imports syntax. And then here's the exporting and extending and returns. So just kind of watch out for all of that. All right. The modern way to do it, and how I'm going to do everything else, is function-based components. You can use the function keyword, or you can use const with an anonymous function. And it's actually most common for React developers to use arrow functions with anonymous functions like I've shown here. The name should be in Pascal case, just like a class. That's pretty consistent with the way components are done in a lot of JavaScript web application things like Angular and React. So we're going to make sure that's in Pascal case. The function should return the JSX. So the entire thing is the function. It just needs to have that return. And then you use parentheses again to enclose any JSX that has multiple lines. So I have that here. I've shown it with the parentheses. And then there's also this react.fragment, or the shortcut for that is just to have empty little, less than and greater than signs here to enclose multiple tags so that you don't have to have any sort of structural or styling implications. Now, what I mean by that is, like, let's look at our example here. I have an H1 heading. I have an H4, like a sub, heading, and then I've got a paragraph. I don't really intend to have to wrap this in a div just so I can return a single element, but I'm required to return a single element. And it can have stuff nested in it, but it has to be a single element. But I don't really want this to be inside a div because I'm taking care of all of my structuring and my styling separately elsewhere. I want the component to just fit in and then use whatever rules of what it's in once the component has been placed. So in order to pass along all 3 lines of these without having to worry about that by putting it in a div or something like that, I can use these as just a wrapper to make it where it's legal for me to return these as if they're one element because they're nested inside of this wrapper. Okay. So again, we have keywords, export and const, and then return. These are the wrapper little brackets here. And that's it. We just return, whatever we need to be returned here. And, this example, again, it doesn't have any JavaScript yet, right? We're going to get there. Don't worry about that. We're going to have some examples of how we're combining the HTML and the JavaScript together. So let's create a second component here in our components directory. I'm going to call this one main. This is going to be our main part of our page. And this will be a functional component. So I don't need to import React or component, the component class or anything like that. I can just start defining my function. So I'm going to use const and then main with a capital M. and then use an arrow function here to make the definition for the entire component. So inside here, I need to have some JSX that I'm returning. So I'll say return, and I've got several lines, so I'm going to put it in parentheses. And everything is going to be inside a main. So this is going to be my one thing that I return, and everything else is nested. So I don't need those, the fragment that I showed you before in this particular case. So we'll have a div in here, and I'll have an H3. And I'm going to call this available plants. So what we're headed with this application, the purpose of it is for us to be able to plan out a flower bed. And we're going to have a list on the left of all of the plants that are available and how many of each that we have. And then on the right side, ultimately, what we're going to work toward by the time we get to part 3 of React is to have the actual flower bed represented, where we can allocate plants to that flower bed and keep track of how many we have put in that flower bed and how many we still have available that we could potentially use somewhere else. So we're just going to work on that left side for right now and just have a section to list out the available plants. And so we'll have a little header here, and I'm just going to put a little paragraph here for a second that says, plants will go here, because we're not ready to actually put that information in just yet. And so the last thing to do is to make sure that this is exported. And if I want it exported as default, I'm going to do it down here at the end. With functions, we need to do it this way. So I'll do it on the last line. Okay, let's see. I feel like there was one more thing I was going to do here. Is there anything else? I don't think so for now. Okay. We are going to actually use some data and, list something out here in a little bit. So right now, we've got 2 components, but our app still has a bunch of junk that's left over from before, right? Let's go talk about how we're going to place them, and then we will clean out the stuff that we don't want and put in what we do want. So every time you place a component in your application, you're placing it as though it's a custom element, like right alongside all of your HTML elements. It's usually a self-closing tag. And you just use the name of the component, but you have to make sure it's imported if it's defined in a different module. And usually you're going to have most of your components separately defined in different files. And then you just place it within the JSX that's returned from whatever component you're currently in, and make sure it's just part of that JSX that's being returned. The very top level component in your application is called app. So that's where we want to make sure that things like our main and header are going to go. So in this example, I have 2 buttons, cancel button and submit button, both coming from buttons.js. And I'd like to import them. So I use destructuring here to pull them both out from that export object that's created. And now I can access them each individually. So I create a new component here, button group. And this one returns some JSX, and I just create a div and I give it a little class name. And then I say I want to have the cancel button and the submit button right next to each other inside this div. And I just use them just like that. So again, they look like custom elements, right? And you just have the name of the component, and then you close it with a slash to make sure it's self-closing. That's the most basic way to place code in your file so that it will render on the page. So there's the import, and there's where we place them in the JSX. So let's go over and take care of that. First thing we're going to do here is clean out all of this stuff that we have no intention of using. That was just for the purpose of having some, demo stuff when we first started it up, right? We're not going to need any of that, so I will delete those imports up there that are unnecessary. And I'm just going to import header. And it went and found it for me because I have already exported it from that file. And I'm going to actually make this a div here instead of a fragment, and give it an ID of page layout, because when we get to adding some CSS, that's going to be necessary. And then in here, I can just put header and put a closing slash just like that. So let's go over and take a look here. Okay, and it says garden planning tool. Now it still says it's still all styled like they had their thing styled, because I haven't put my own CSS in here yet. We can go over to index CSS and clean all this out, and we can also go to app.css and clean all this out. They had it in two different places. And I'm going to use both of these files to put some stuff in a little bit. But for now, we're kind of back to looking very 1995 because there's no styling going on whatsoever, right? That's okay. That's what I want. I want to start fresh. So we'll close those for now. We'll get back to them later. That's it. So we see our header component. And again, this is just the content. It's that's provided by the header component. I've placed it into the app inside this div. And so we see it, and we can prove it. We can come over and open up our dev tools and ignore the console. And let's take a look here at what's happening here. Let me see if I can make this bigger for you. Okay. So if we go in here, we see our div with our page layout right inside the div with root, which you may remember was, we go back to our index.html, there's the div with root. And you remember we said that everything from app was going to render inside here. So now we can see it, right? Inside root, the next thing we see is our div that's got the ID of page layout, and that's holding the header and the H2 that are coming from the header component. So now you have an idea of how it pulls it all together and, you know, builds this app out of all these different components, right? So let's do the other one. And this time I'm going to come down here. I haven't imported it yet. I'm going to just say main, and notice that now, yeah, the Vite is unhappy. It's trying to serve it, and I'm in the middle of screwing things up, so it doesn't like it, but ignore that. We'll get back to it. You'll notice that it is recognizing here, VS Code recognizes that, hey, you have something called main over here in this components folder. So I can just tab and complete that. And then all I have to do is add the self-closing part and finish the tag. And notice the import statement got added for me up here. So you can always have it add import for you by just starting to type it in and tabbing over when it finds it. Either way will work. All right, so now we see available plants. Plants will go here. And again, we can check here, and we see exactly the HTML that we provided from the main component right here next to the header component. So we can start to see how the application's building out, right, with these different components put together. All right, so we have two components. This is good. The next thing we need to talk about is what happens if you have a component you would like to use, but you have some variable data. Like it could be, you know, information that you're receiving from an API somewhere, and you know, you receive it and then you need to actually place it into your application. How do you pass it into the component so the component can make use of it? There's this idea of props, which is kind of short for properties, that's going to let you make your components reusable and allow you to pass information from one component to another. And the component can be very generic, so that it can just use, you know, you use variables, and it'll just accept whatever specific values you pass in through the props. Every prop needs to be placed on the component's tag as an attribute. So let's say we're ready to put a text input on our page. We place it by creating this custom element here, text input, self-closing, and then we add attributes. ID is first name, label is first name. And then maybe we have a second text input, and this would be for a form, right? ID is last name, label is last name, and then we have a submit button that's been placed here below. So you can see that we used our text input twice and gave it different information each time for these same props. That means that the text input component needs to be defined to accept props for ID and label and make use of those inside the definition. But when you actually provide the data, this is how you do it with these attributes, which are essentially key value pairs, right? Okay, so those get treated as an object. It passes everything as an object. We call that object prop, or props, plural. So whatever the attribute is, that's the value that gets passed in. So there they are, props as attributes, and there's their values. So how do you actually define this in the first place so that we can make use of these if we're passing them in? Just remember that props is a single object. No matter how many props you have, they're going to be key value pairs in that object. So you can access them the same way you would any JavaScript object using props. And you really can use any name you want, but props is the convention. It's what most people use to represent any props that are being passed in. So one of the props was ID, right? Props.id is how I access it. I'm going to create a local variable here in my component called ID that uses props.id together with input and hyphen to create a full ID value that I want to put on this input. So then I create my input, and this is just a regular HTML input element, and I assign the ID to it so that I can use that for lots of purposes, right? I can use it for assigning this label to it, for example. And I can also use it for things like styling, right? We use IDs as selectors for styling. So now I have a very specific ID so that no matter what the ID is that's passed in every time I use the text input, it's going to make a custom ID and place it on it. And the idea, of course, behind that is that each instance of text input would have its own ID that's unique. And then we can do the same thing with the label. We receive the label, we can use props.label and just put that right here between the label tags, and it will just provide it so that every single instance of text input that we have has a unique label because we were able to pass it in as shown on the previous slide. You can also access these with destructuring. Here I've shown it done with just dot notation off of props, props.id, props.label. But I'm going to show you in my code where I'm going to use some destructuring so that I can access these values directly. So again, there's the parameter props, and you see here where I'm using it to get each individual prop ID and label from the props object. Let's create a third component that will accept props. We're going to call this available plant.jsx. And this is going to be another functional component, available plant. I'll use an arrow function here. And I'm going to use destructuring this time to get all of the information that I want from my props. However, I don't yet know what it is, what my data is. So the other thing I need to do is actually, go back and say, what kind of data am I going to be working with? What are the different values that I'm going to have? Let's use some test data. So this is a very common strategy for a developer to use. We don't immediately go to fetching data from an API or some sort of endpoint that has been provided by the guy, the backend guys on our team or whatever. We don't do that up front. We get some test data and we just put it in here and we call it dummy data or things like that, test data. And we just work with that for a little while, but it's representative of the type of thing that we might actually be pulling in if we were fetching. So we're going to do that. I'm going to have some basic JavaScript, not JSON, but just JavaScript. And I'm going to call this my temporary test data, so that we can just practice getting these in place and making sure they work. And so this is the type of information that ultimately I am going to fetch. And it has these properties. Each object has an ID, a name, a color, an image, and the number available. So I'm going to start off with this and say, okay, here's some of the information that I could potentially display. So if I want to be able to use this, then I'm going to need to be able to pass it down to whatever instances of the available plant component that I decide to place here, where right now it just says plants will go here. We're going to change that. We're actually going to have multiple available plant components here, and each one is going to take information from a different object here. So I'm going to say that the things we're probably going to make use of for now would be everything except the image. We're not going to try to put images on here yet because we're not retrieving real data. So I'll just do the ID, name, color, and num available. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pass this entire object down and call it plant. That's going to be the prop that I use, is plant. So that means that if I were to refer to that object, I would refer to it as props.plant, right? But inside that object, I have multiple things that I'd like to have access to. So I'm going to destructure ID, name, color, and num available from props.plant. So I'm going to take the object that's passed in through props and go get its individual values from the different keys inside that plant object. And now I can just use these as my variables here and return my JSX that I want to display for this component. So let's just return a paragraph and have an ID that uses, there we go. I'm going to use a JSX placeholder and put in ID. And then between the p tags, I'm going to just have some text for now. This is going to get a lot fancier in the future when we learn how to do more things. But for now, we're just going to stick to doing a little bit of a proof of concept where we can just at least see this information on the page with some of our test data for now. That's how we do things. We start small. Okay, so we're going to say name, color, and then the number available with the word available after it. And so every time we have an available plant component displayed, it's going to have that information for whichever plant is passed in. That's the idea here. Okay, so let's come back over here. Oh, we do need to export it before we can use it. So let's do that. Export default available plant. Okay. Now we can come over here and actually place an instance of this. I can say available plant. And notice that because I let VS Code kind of guide me to it, it put the import statement up here. So now inside this custom element for this component, this is where I put the plant prop on here and say, I would like to pass down, and I'm going to use a JSX placeholder here to actually provide test plants at index 0. Okay, so I'm just using the first object from my little test data here in this array, test plants at index 0, and that entire object gets passed down under the prop plant. And then in here, we receive the plant prop as props.plant, and then I'm deconstructing ID, name, color, and num available out of that object. So if we come back over here to our page, we see hyacinth, blue, and 8 available. That's great, right? It's working. It's passing down the plant information and using all of the individual properties to display that information on the page. But I would like to have 2 more of them. The proof of concept here is that we can reuse this component multiple times. So I'm going to say index 1 and index 2, and then we should see our tulip and daffodil show up, and we do. So we have hyacinth, tulip, and daffodil. And now you can see why components are so great. I only had to define a very small amount of code here, and I can use it as many times as I want to and have things come out the same every single time and look exactly the way I want them to. Okay, we are going to learn in a future class how to loop and produce these by looping rather than having to hard code them with hard coded indices like this. Because obviously this is not ideal. And you can imagine if you had an application that had hundreds of results, you couldn't sit here and do that, right? So we'll change that in the future. But for now, we're going to leave it like this just because it's a proof of concept. We're just testing things with our test data here, and that's enough for now. So there are different ways to use CSS with React when you're ready to style your components. You can put global CSS in the index.css file. Because as we showed here before, if you look in main.jsx, you can see where that's been imported at this very high level where app is placed. And that means it's available to the entire hierarchy of all of the components underneath that. So that's certainly a good place to put it. And you can actually also put it in app CSS as long as that has been imported into your app file as well. I'm going to do a little bit of both, but those would both essentially be global. You can also import a style sheet as a module and then use dot or bracket notation. And in some of your assignments that you're going to do with LaunchCode from the curriculum, they're going to have you do it this way. So I wanted to make sure to show it to you. You're going to import something and give it a name to represent all of the CSS objects that are coming from that file. And then wherever you need to use them, like let's say you're going to provide an ID here, you can say, I want that to match the ID that's in styles that is, about us. And I want this class name to be styles.small so that I can apply the class from that file to this div, right? Another way to do it would be to use libraries like styled components or Bootstrap. I have used both and they're very handy. And then there's a special note here. You can't use class. You may have noticed this is class name here. That's because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, and this is not plain HTML. This is JSX. It has a combination of HTML and JavaScript. So you can't have class here or it isn't going to be able to transpile it properly. So we use class name instead, and that means it ignores it and doesn't worry about, the fact that it could be confused with JavaScript. So that might take some getting used to if you're pretty accustomed to using class with your HTML. If you're using React for the first time, this will take some getting used to, but you will get used to it. I can attest to that. So again, if you're importing a file and using it with bracket notation or dot notation, just make sure that you import it with some sort of name to represent it, something like styles, and then just use that to access the things that you want to connect with IDs or classes or whatever within the JSX. And there again, use class name instead of class. All right. What I would like to do is to add mine. I'm going to put a little bit of it in app.css. So let me go to this one. And the only thing I'm doing there is my page layout, which is in my app.jsx. I've applied that here to this div. So we can come over here and already see that some things are starting to change in terms of the layout of the page. But most of my CSS is actually in the index.css file. So I will go copy that over. And I've got a whole bunch of stuff in here. I do think that I may have not applied all of the classes that I intended to. So let me take a look at my JSX here and also in the header and make sure that I've got what I need. Yeah, there should be an ID on the div here of left column. Remember, I said that ultimately we're also going to have a right column. For now, we just have the left column. And that should take care of that. And let me just double check header here, see if there's anything I was supposed to place in there. Nope. So the last thing we're missing here is our background image. And I have a image file on my clipboard. So what I'm going to do is come in here into assets and create a folder. Call it images. This is typically where you would put this sort of thing. And then I'm going to paste it in here. We can see it's blossoms.jpg. And if we take a look at our index.css, we can see right here that it's expecting the body to take the background image assets/images/blossoms.jpg. And you'll notice that it has not automatically shown up, even though this is live, right? That's because with certain things, you actually are going to have to restart your application. So I'm going to come down here into my terminal and hit Control-C, and then start it back up with npm run dev. And there it is. Okay. So far so good. I feel like there is still one thing off. I think the font is not taking up here for the, yes, that's true. And I know exactly why. Okay. We actually need to put the font information from Google up there. So let me go grab that. I'm going to go into the top of my index.html file into the head here. And right after this meta tag, I will put in all these links, and that will give me my Google Fonts. And while we're at it, I'm going to change this title so that it'll change it on the tab and say Garden Planning Tool. Okay. So now we see our tab says Garden Planning Tool. We have our font here. Everything's starting to look good. It's getting a little more cohesive, a little easier to read, and it definitely does not look like 1995. Okay. So that's just a first introduction to React. And we're going to be able to take it from here and learn how to do things that are even cooler. And by the time we get to part 3, we're going to have quite a lot of functionality in this app. For your studio, you will go to chapter 29 and use Vite to add a new project to your part 1 folder in the existing repository you have for your JavaScript projects. Then to create several components, arrange them on the page the way they instruct you to, and just remember to make lots of git commits as you're going along the way so that you can, take those small snapshots. And I do have a review of that studio up on YouTube as well. All right, I will see you in the next lecture.